All right. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar, Capacitor 1.0, a new way to build native mobile apps with Ionic. My name is Rachel, and I'm on the marketing team here, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. I've also got Matt Netko here with me, and he's the head of developer relations and will be giving today's presentation. So before passing it over to him, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping topics. First, today's webinar is going to be recorded. We're going to share a link to the presentation after the event is finished. So feel free to revisit the content and share with your colleagues. And this event is going to be about 30 minutes long. And after, we're going to do a question and answer session. So if you have comments or questions during the event, please submit them in the question and answer chat box on your screen. So with all of that said, I'd like to pass it over to Matt for his presentation. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Rachel. And hey, everyone, really excited to be here today for our Capacitor launch webinar. My name is Matt Netko, head of our developer relations team at Ionic. And you can find me all over social media fairly easy. And feel free to send me an email with any follow-up questions and things like that. So let's get started. What are we covering? We've got a lot of things to talk about. And let's start off with talking a little bit, for those of you that might be new to Ionic or are curious about us, we'll talk about everything that goes into Ionic and the hybrid app kind of stack and background, how that works. And then we'll kind of look at, this main star players of today, Cordova and Capacitor, starting with kind of a brief history of Cordova itself. And then work into, all this new info about what Capacitor is and essentially launching that. It's very exciting. We'll talk about the differences between the two, Cordova and Capacitor. And then I'm going to get into a live demo where I talk through and show how to add Capacitor to an existing Ionic app that's using Cordova, and also show off an app that we've been working on that will show off a bunch of different APIs that Capacitor has today. So really cool stuff. And kind of end and wrap up the presentation with some notes on how you might manage your migration strategy from moving from Cordova to Capacitor. And of course, as we've always done, getting started resources, things to look out for, and we'll end with a live Q&A. So as Rachel said, we have our questions box on the side. Please leave any questions there and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So before we really jump into the Cordova and Capacitor and everything about this, I wanted to personally take a second and share a note on why I'm excited about Capacitor. I've been a professional .NET developer for about 10 years now and have joined Ionic about a year ago. And there's a bunch of really neat things that I've gone through working with Cordova myself that I wanted to talk about. I had started as kind of more of a back-end developer working with .NET technologies and building APIs. And then, around 2012, a few years ago, I noticed that this thing called JavaScript was really blowing up. It had been around for a long time, and I had kind of dabbled with jQuery and things like that, but, I didn't really learn it really well and know it really well. And so I started on the path of learning JavaScript and got really hooked, started moving my skills to more of the front-end kind of stack. And then I got to this place where, as well as JavaScript, mobile applications and building for mobile, iOS and Android in particular, became huge, right? It was those early 2010 days of everyone jumping on board with that. And as a solo developer, I decided I wanted to build mobile apps, but I didn't want to spend all this time learning all these different programming languages and new paradigms and things. So I found this technology that called Cordova, that let me use my web skills to build, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, to build real mobile apps that are basically native apps on the stores. And back then there were some rough edges and things like that, some challenges that I had, but I saw the potential for that, the ability to reuse my skills, and I was able to do that without this is before Ionic. So I didn't use Ionic. It was still in its kind of infancy. I used some other third-party UI frameworks and things like that, along with Cordova, to build several successful cross-platform apps, web, iOS, and Android. And I even was able to earn thousands of dollars on the app stores. And why I say that and bring that up is if I was able to do that all those years ago with Cordova and some other technology, without Ionic, what could you possibly do with Ionic and Capacitor today in 2019. Whether you're like me back then working solo or on a team or a company. And so as you can imagine, like if that's part of what's possible, it's only getting better, and that's what I'm really excited to talk about today. So let's get into it. A brief background on Ionic itself. So we are, if in case you're kind of new to us, we are a mobile ready and really cross-platform UI library and toolkit. That's our framework, right? That works everywhere, any platform, any device, any framework. And the real magic here is that you reuse your existing web skills, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, to build for iOS, Android, Electron, PWAs, everything. And the main magic of that is creating one code base that can go across all these platforms with your web skills. And perhaps most important and the biggest question on folks' minds is, well, what are the compromises there? Can I actually target and use all these different native APIs and features like camera, Bluetooth, geolocation, all that stuff? And the answer is yes, you can. So we have full access to all of those different types of native features. And that kind of gets us into the other term you may or may not have heard, which is called a hybrid application. And that's essentially what we're building when we're especially targeting native mobile, Android and iOS. The idea there is we're, again, using our web skills which are then packaged inside of a real native app shell. So at the end of the day, for your end users, excuse me, for your end users, it's still a native app. You get full access to all the different device functionality, as I mentioned. And what happens is your Ionic app or your web app is running inside of a web view within that native app. And just think of that really as an embedded browser within that native app wrapper, right? So your code can run everywhere, and you can reach potentially millions of users with that. There's some other cool things too, like we can drop into the native side of things with iOS and Android and build out different plugins and features that maybe are unique to your app that you need. And you can even embed web views into native apps today. In fact, many companies do that, which opens up all kinds of different possibilities there. So really cool. So, up till now, that native layer, that native wrapper we've been talking about has been PhoneGap or Cordova. They're basically synonymous. So let's take a look at what that entails. So a brief history here. The team behind Cordova created it back around 2008, so it's been about 10 years now. That really solved, again, this pain point that developers like myself were looking for, right? We have these web skills and we want to reuse them and especially get onto the exciting mobile platforms, right, that everyone has these days. So the kind of mantra there was write once, run everywhere. And that's really what Ionic is all about, been all about since the beginning and continues to be. So, it's been, ongoing updates to Cordova and the ecosystem. It's all fully open source, which is wonderful, backed by a great community as well. And, up till now, where we are at in 2018, 2019 are really ongoing minor updates to the platform, things like that. And, for many years that worked just fine for everyone involved using it, including myself. But there's some challenges there, right? The biggest one is native platforms love to move fast, right? And unfortunately, Cordova has had some trouble keeping up with those types of changes. Specifically, iOS and Android are constantly undergoing different changes, whether that's new operating system updates multiple times a year, new hardware like the iPhone notch, or we've got foldable screens apparently coming out, about now or so. All these kind of things affect Cordova and really any Ionic as well, right? We have to keep up with these kind of things and move fast and ensure that we're deploying and supporting these different features. And you've got on the more native side of things, more modern plugin system capabilities with CocoaPods and Gradle, dependency management that hasn't been supported by Cordova. As well as wanting to use more native, more modern native languages like Swift and Kotlin. So the team at Ionic here, we thought, well, what if we created a spiritual successor to Cordova that could use all these modern native tools and provide just really an overall better developer experience? And that, our solution to that is Capacitor. So let's dig into what it looks like. So Capacitor, at the end of the day, has very much the same type of goals as Cordova, right? It's our cross-platform runtime created by the Ionic team that allows you to target all different types of native platforms like iOS, Android, the desktop using Electron, and the web. And that's a big one there. Traditionally, Cordova has had kind of spotty support for the web, and now we're kind of unleashing all these APIs and features that allow you to truly have one code base and do all these cool, implement all these cool features and things like that. And a big question on top of everyone's mind, at least from what I've seen, is, well, what does support for Cordova look like? And I'm very happy to share that for the majority of plugins today, we have full backward compatibility. There are a handful that don't work for various legacy technology reasons or reasons we had to choose to not support them to provide the best capacitor experience that we could. We have a full list for that. We'll kind of talk through that. And additionally, one of the things we're kind of doing with Capacitor is staying as close to the native browser capabilities as possible. So what that allows us to do is ensure that great stability and maintainability for you, as well as just by staying close to web standards, we can ensure that things will work for a long time to come. And what our kind of mantra is with Capacitor this time around is kind of code once, configure everywhere. So we'll kind of talk next about the differences and things, but at the end of the day, we're making a kind of a interesting, but I think for the long term, we feel the right way to go, which is embracing more of the native modern tooling, which will help you, again, maintain your projects a lot easier than in the past with Cordova. And we've, taken a lot of inspiration from Cordova itself, a lot of lessons learned over the past 10 years plus that the Ionic team has, we've always given back to the project and have learned a lot of things along the way, as well as inspiration from React Native and TurboLinks and lots of great open source projects that have gone into our thinking behind it. So what are, really next big thing to cover is what are the differences between Cordova and Capacitor, right? There's two really major kind of aspects here. The first one is native project management. And here is where we really get into some interesting architecture kind of design changes, but we think they'll serve everyone well for the long term. So the first one is source assets versus build time assets. So with Capacitor, we're treating the native projects that are generated, iOS, Android, Electron, whatever, as code that you actually check in and maintain, and they're essentially first-class citizens in that sense. So versus Cordova, where when you're interacting with them, adding plugins, making changes, they can get wiped away or end up in different states of use and things like that. And it can be hard to maintain, right? So kind of the benefit of making and having real native projects that you hold on to there's a bunch of reasons really. So it makes it easier to add custom native code into those projects because they are sticking around without creating a new plugin. We do have great ways of creating new capacitor related plugins, but it's easier to go into those IDEs and make those kind of changes, as well as and my exciting, I think my most favorite benefit is an easier ability for native mobile teams to work with web teams. So again, you no longer have this kind of conflict where both teams are making changes and perhaps interrupting each other's work. They're really separate web and native mobile and every other platform projects. So you can be developing over time, especially for larger teams. That's a huge, huge, huge thing, right? And along with those changes, perhaps the one of the most interesting thing is we've done away with kind of custom configuration. We're kind of pushing you towards using the platform-specific IDE. So that's Xcode for iOS and Android Studio for Android. So no longer we're going to have kind of an abstracted layer, which today for Cordova is config XML, which if you use Cordova, you're very intimately familiar with that and everything that goes on with that. So what that allows us to do, though, is by not having that abstraction over the native layers, it gives you far more control and visibility into the native project changes, and overall leads to a better experience maintaining apps over time. A bunch of you have probably run into situations where you come back to an app after some amount of time and try to rebuild it and update all these dependencies and just have it simply not work or not build in the first place, right? So we're trying to make that experience a lot smoother and better for everyone involved. The kind of also side benefit of that is if you do run into native issues, could be build issues, all different types of things, it'll be much easier to troubleshoot because we're not creating our own Ionic branded way of building these. You have direct access to the native projects, and therefore searching online in different forums, posting online to get help will match basically one-to-one with what those native answers and things are. So I really love that part of it. Additionally, when we do have updates, which will be not every single release, but if there are updates to the native project templates, iOS, Android, and what have you, we will be sure to release step-by-step upgrade instructions to kind of walk you through manually making those changes, right? And they won't be, the goal of there is to keep that simple as simple as possible. So overall, again, by kind of embracing, and we'll take a look at this with the demo, but embracing the native platform IDEs will just lead to a better experience for everyone. Secondary, we have plugin and CLI, command line interface management changes. The main one for plugin development and maintainability is building them with more modern capabilities, so as frameworks on iOS and libraries on Android. And so there's a lot of different things that go into that. You no longer have to copy plugin files directly into your project. In fact, you can, they're full-fledged libraries, etc., and just code that can be developed outside of your Ionic app or your web app, right? Again, teams can work independently and come together, and that'll be a great thing for all involved. And additionally, because of that, we're integrating and using and steering you towards the leading dependency management tools, which again will have be better maintained and by those types of teams, and we don't have to lead you down a, again, abstracted layer that can be confusing to follow. When it comes to working through and creating your own plugins, we've got a great plugin generation command and other tooling there and documentation around that that gives you full scaffolding, I believe unit tests as well, really just setting you up for success from the start, especially if you're newer to native mobile development. And again, overall less error prone, and will make it easier to find help in the community for each platform when you're working on troubleshooting plugins. Additionally, Capacitor registers and exports all JavaScript for every plugin at runtime. And basically what that means is all of your code is available right away at runtime when your app starts up, right? So no more need for the device ready event, which if you've worked with Cordova, you've probably run into that. Issues with trying to use different plugins right away and having your app crash or not work well and being confused about that. We've kind of simplified that, and that concept has kind of gone away with this. And then another really neat thing is we have, compared to Cordova that typically gets installed globally on your machine, the Capacitor CLI gets installed locally into each project. So the benefit there is it's easier to manage different versions of Capacitor across all of your different apps. Again, the whole idea of it is it's one from your web to native project to the dependencies are all one tightly but like separate maintained kind of code base that can be, when you move between machines or doing continuous, CI/CD, continuous delivery type practices, it'll be a lot easier to maintain those projects going forward. So I'm excited let's get into some demos. I want to show off a couple of different features of Capacitor. We'll start with adding Capacitor to an existing Ionic app and then demo some of the Capacitor APIs themselves. So let's see, switch on over here. All right. So what I have here is a real internal Ionic project that I've been working on. Not released yet, open sourced yet, probably will be at some point, but it's kind of an human resources related application for managing expenses and employee data, things like that. Completely made up data, and things like that, but it's kind of a good template and starting point that I wanted to show everyone. So I'm going to run a few of our commands and kind of get started. But the first thing to notice is this is an app using Cordova today, the camera and the file plugin and some other ones. You'll notice like classic Cordova, we've got our platforms, Android and iOS installed, as well as plugins, excuse me. And let's add, as well as config XML, which again is that abstracted layer that lets you configure different platforms, such as icons and splash screens, settings for the plugins themselves, all those kind of versions and dependencies that you're typically aware of with this. So what I'm going to do start is, what's really great about it is if you have an existing Ionic app, it's really easy to add Capacitor. So let's do that. So we're going to run Ionic integrations, enable Capacitor. Let's do that. And this is going to walk us through a couple steps. There's really only a handful of things to get started. It's going to install. We've got most of this is driven as web packages published on npm, just like you're used to with any modern web development. So it's going to install the core of Capacitor as well as the CLI, and then basically that's adding that. We'll go through adding some platforms, and what this kind of looks like is we get that set up, and you'll notice a new file has been added, Capacitor config. And what this is a little bit different than our config.xml from Cordova. You'll notice it's very simple, very clean. We've got our app ID and app name, so very similar to what those will configure and be used in our native mobile projects and beyond. And we can always override the app ID and things like that. And I think really the biggest thing to mention here is the web directory of www is our typical Ionic build target. When you run an Ionic build, it'll Capacitor will use that for copying the web code into your native projects. And then the next thing we kind of see, the next steps here is we can add any platforms we'd like to support. So I'm going to run npx cap add Android, kind of take a look at that. And actually I did miss a step, so we need to run a fresh Ionic build if we haven't already. I had kind of set up this project as a scaffolding earlier and forgot the Ionic build, so we'll do that really quick. But while that's running, you can take a look and see. Yeah, no, we'll get that going in a second. What else to point out? So what's really neat is over time, as we add more platform support, that'll be integrated in the CLI. The main ones, of course, are Android, iOS, and Electron for now. So I'm gonna re-add that, add the Android dependencies. Let's install some of those. Okay, so you'll notice as this is installing, again, all of the native projects are a major part of your source code, right? So we also, instead of being build targets that can get cleaned out and wiped easily, this is the Android project that is an entire Android app within my code base, and we can dig into that in a little bit. But as well as like when we add iOS, we'll have an iOS folder, Electron, things like that. And what's really neat about this that's worth pointing out is Capacitor smartly looks at your existing Cordova plugins that you're using and copies them and does a lot of magic behind the scenes to add them to your new native project when you add the platform. In this case, it was Android. So a couple of things to note. We see that it's found 5 different plugins for Android, such as the camera and file, like I had mentioned, we're using. And it's doing a bunch of things to build those plugins, the native bits. And then where it's looking is our, just like any web dependencies, it's looking at and pulling that list from package.json, so, and as well as the version numbers. So all of that's right there, just using what you're typically the same way that you're building Ionic apps, like we do dependency management. And it'll even tell you if it found incompatible Cordova plugins, and it'll skip installing them. Again, we have a page up in the documentation we're launching today that will kind of explain more about that. But at a high level, with some of the plugins like Splash Screen, we do natively within Capacitor now, so we don't need that one. The Ionic Web View, that one is skipped as well because with Capacitor, we're embracing the main web views of each platform. So some of it isn't necessarily that it's anything's broken per se, but they're just design decisions that we went with and aren't really needed for that. So it'll give you a great printout here, and I love that it kind of reminds you about explicitly what versions you have and things like that. And then the next command, as it's shown here, is when we launch into or want to launch and debug the app, we can run npxcap android here. I had previously, just for time, I had previously opened that, so I'm going to switch over to that. So what this does is, which is a big difference from Cordova, it can be really hard to find the APK that's been built on the file system, but here this launches the project, the whole native project here, and it can be a little. I understand, even I was kind of apprehensive when I was getting into this of like, well, do I have to learn how deep do I have to go on the native IDEs and things like that? And to be honest, for getting started, there's really not too much to do. We can just, a lot of it comes with building and running, very much like other tools you might have used. There's a play button here, and we can just deploy it to a phone and an Android device I have right now. So I'm going to switch this and launch this on a real device here, because what I want to do is really confirm. There we go. So here's my Android device. I'm going to hit OK. We see it building down in the lower left here. And great, that's going to fire up. And what I really want to confirm is, again, I just added Capacitor to the app. I want to make sure that, especially the camera is still working. So let's give that a shot. So again, not open source at this point, but that's okay. We'll probably release that at some point. But we have, a kind of simple list of very made up data for like a people registry directory. And then where the camera and file system are used are our expenses screen here. So I'm able to add a new expense. And what I want to do is just really quick show or test that the camera's working. We'll see our little recording studio here live. I'll take a photo and hit start. All right, awesome. So what's really great about that is I didn't have to make any code changes. My Cordova plugins are working exactly as I left them. And so that's a huge part and benefit of migrating to Capacitor. We'll get more into that in a second, but that's one of my favorite aspects of working with Capacitor. The next app I wanted to kind of talk through is show off some of our APIs here. So today I'll be open sourcing this app, which is really exciting. We don't have kind of the idea behind it is giving you a window into playing around with the Capacitor core APIs themselves. We've got about 15 to 20 that we're launching with today. And we can, the idea behind this app is it's an Ionic 4 app that's gives you a simple menu with links to description of what the APIs do, links to all the documentation for each one, and you can see both on the web and Android and iOS how they actually work. So let me pull up this app. There we go, on the Android device, and we'll kind of see some differences and things like that. So here's, I'll just kind of go through a couple of them that I wanted to point out. Admittedly, I don't have all of the APIs implemented today. We'll continue to add those up, but they're, here's the full list. This is the correct full list today. But what's really neat is, again, we'll start with like the device information API, showing off which specific device this is, different model numbers, battery level even, and we can see that we're running as we are, right? This is running in the web browser on the left with the web platform and on my Mac. And then on the right, in the mobile app, we've got a lot more details, including that we're running on Android, things like that. Let's look at something more interesting. So we have a camera API as well. That's as for anyone that's seen previous webinars, I love the camera. That's really fun. What's really cool on this is, again, we're bringing with one the ability to write, one line of code for accessing a lot of these plugins. We're bringing that to the web as well. So I'm going to show that in a minute. But on the Android device, I can again open up the camera, and take a picture. And then also we have, via our PWA Elements library, we have the ability to take a picture with the camera, which looks like that's not, looks like it's having a little bit of problem there. Probably my laptop overheating. So basically this is a UI that will pop open the webcam. All of you looking at me, and we'll be able to take a picture. That's fine, we can move on. And then we also have some really, let me close that. Sweet. And then we have some things like, accessing local notifications, modals. We have things for, the browser plugin would be used for OAuth situations, authenticating users, opening different web pages, that maybe your company's website, things like that. Let's look at modals though. So basic, kind of like basic alert statements here on the web and over on Android, say like get a parrot. And we can kind of see that, different UI. This is again using some of the Ionic 4 components for, native looking UI and things like that. Cancel that. And let's see, last little look at maybe like toast messages. You can show a long toast on the web, or excuse me, on Android on the right side, peanut butter jelly time, and as well on the web here. So really, this is just the very, high level overview of what our APIs look like, but expect to see more in the over time and things like that. And again, if there's when it comes to plugins or things that we don't have currently, we're going to talk next about what that might look like. All right. So if you have an existing Ionic app that's using Cordova, or even a web app that's not using Ionic, it's important to mention that Capacitor does work with all web projects. It's not Ionic specific, and can work with Ionic 1 to 4 and anything that comes in the future, right? So that's part of the great aspect of the project. It's not just tied to us. There's all types of use cases for it, and different types of web projects that can start leveraging it. But if you do have an existing app that's using Cordova, let's talk a little bit about like the migration strategy. So why migrate? What's involved at a high level? Well, the biggest thing to mention is it's really about long-term stability and peace of mind. Now that we have this tool under the Ionic suite of tools and products, you can expect updates and releases a lot quicker than the Cordova ecosystem. And just in general, being managed by us will have longer stability and other kinds of things we can do to keep the project going. Additionally, again, we have Cordova backward compatibility, as we saw from my demo there. For the most part, adding it to the project should just work, and you get all the benefits of working with native projects, and really the sky's the limit from there, right? Something to mention though, Ionic we've been a long-term open source contributors to the Cordova community. That's not going to change. We're going to continue to invest in the Cordova ecosystem for a long time to come. So no worries there. We're not abandoning it or anything like that. But that said, we do feel strongly that Ionic and Capacitor are the future for building modern web apps and cross-platform hybrid apps. Kind of a brief note on what the migration process might look like if you're considering this. We saw how easy it was to add Capacitor to an existing app. But I think the first step really that I recommend is, take this, if you're interested in it, take this time to, audit your list of Cordova plugins you're using today. Take a look and see, do you need to use all of them, or are there some that you can deprecate and remove from your project? Take a fresh look at what you're using and see. And then if you do, for whatever ones that remain, start to migrate them over if you can. Again, we do have a bunch of the core APIs are what I just showed off in that sample app. And then the community has been contributing lots of different plugins and APIs as well. So take a look in our documentation. And again, if there's incompatible ones that just aren't working, or there's ones that we don't cover from the core list, that's totally fine. Continue to Capacitor and Cordova, as you saw, work side by side. So continue to use that as well as our Ionic native plugin suite and TypeScript wrappers alongside those. And really, and why I'm so jazzed today and excited is, at the end of the day, what we're getting to with the release of Capacitor is just building up this world-class app building experience, right? That's what the Ionic stack truly is. Fully integrated from top to bottom, right? You pick your framework of choice, so Angular, Vue, React, whatever JavaScript library that comes down the line and is released. Pair that with our Ionic 4 UI toolkit, all our components that come with great animations and just great design, beautiful design out of the box for building apps. And then couple that with Capacitor for your native runtime. So when you want to target, depending on what you want to go after, iOS, Android, progressive web apps, Capacitor is the one to choose for that. And then of course, whatever backend of choice that you're using, from a legacy.NET or PHP app to cloud-based tools like AWS, Firebase, Azure, all those work with Ionic and are very well integrated today. So with that, I'm really excited to announce that as of today, we are launching version 1.0 of Capacitor. So great, big congrats to the rest of the Ionic team, and I'm just really happy to be part of this journey with you all, and excited for you all to give Capacitor a spin. Let's before we get into some questions and things like that, I just wanted to cover briefly, some of the changes from our beta that we've been running the last few months up to our 1.0 release. So really, it's been a lot of stability and maintainability, bug fixes, those kind of things, more behind the scenes type of work that the Capacitor team's been working on, right? So making sure that our native project scaffolding is top notch, dependencies are up to date with those, things like that, right? And also stability changes with bug fixes, and as well as integrating lots and lots of community pull requests from GitHub. Side note, thank you so much to our awesome community for everything you do and everything you submit to us. We've really been impressed with the high quality work and all your types of submissions and fixes and things. So thank you. And in general, we've heard your feedback that you want better integration with all of our different products across the entire Ionic stack that I just talked about. So we're just really putting more and more effort into making sure that that's a great, world-class experience out of the box for you. Additionally, we added some more support for other platforms for some of the core APIs, that list I showed off not long ago, as well as we are launching today, if it's not up there now already, a complete documentation site refresh. So go ahead and check that out. We've got full guides on migrating from Cordova, and all different types of things have been worked and updated for this 1.0 release. So very exciting stuff. And again, it's really easy to get started. So if you're kind of on the fence, or you're really excited to jump in, take a couple minutes and add Capacitor to your apps and give it a shot. From the web, it's just a simple npm install of a couple packages away, as well as running our initialize command. And again, with Ionic, as I showed, it's built into our CLI already. It's ready to go, and give it for a whirl. Take it for a spin. And some resources, always love to show that, and we'll have those in our emails and things we send out after the webinar, of course. But the site's at capacitor.ionicframework.com. Capacitor is fully open source on GitHub. You can find that there pretty easily. And as well as the kitchen sink API demo that I showed off today. Expect more iterations and changes to that over time, but that's available now. And as always, we'll have recording and links emailed out after the webinar. And as I always like to mention, for teams, mid to large size enterprises, things like that, if you do have any questions or need any assistance building your Ionic apps or working with Cordova and Capacitor plugins, we do have enterprise support packages available, so please reach out to me or the Ionic team. We'd love to help you. So with that, that's what I have for today. So thanks for joining me on this great launch journey for Capacitor 1.0. Let's get on over to some questions. Let's bring back Rachel back into the fold here and start leading with some questions.
Great, thanks, Matt. So if you haven't had a chance to yet, please submit questions in the question and answer chat box on your screen. And we're going to take this time to answer a few that have come in. So it looks like the first one that we got was Ionic 3 used Ionic API in most cases. With Ionic 4 and capacitor, I must learn Ionic API, capacitor API, Xcode, etc. Do I totally have to recode current projects?
Oh, yes. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So I think I understand what they're getting at. So yeah, if you have an existing, let's think about this. If you have an existing Ionic 3 app, there's again, Capacitor works with Ionic 3 and every other version of Ionic as well as other web projects. So you know, I think as we've been promoting for several months now, we're really excited about Ionic 4 and definitely recommend moving over to it when you can, but we also recognize that it's not it's easy to say that, but it takes time, right? There's real project management, time, cost, other things that go into that. So the good news though is you don't have to you don't have to migrate immediately. We're still supporting Ionic 3. We're shipping bug fixes every 2 weeks and things like that, so don't worry about that front of it. As well as you can still use Capacitor even today with that Ionic 3 app. And then kind of the second part of that question, with all the different, lots of tools and tech to learn and concerns about learning the native IDEs, I know I only had time to lightly touch into it and show off some of Android Studio in this case, but again, for most of the steps like building your app as a PWA or submitting and building iOS and Android builds, most of that stays the same with this. It's more about just, again, control for and having to learn your way a little bit around managing permissions and some of the features that your Cordova config XML you had to be aware of and things. But again, long term, we are very, yeah, when it comes to the long-term maintainability and actually maintaining Capacitor as well as your projects, it simply will be a lot easier to work with and troubleshoot issues, things like that. So I hope you'll give it a shot.
All right, thanks.
I think we had another question.
Yeah, does this change how Ionic Deploy works?
Ionic Deploy. No, so that's actually, okay, so that's Ionic Deploy is part of our Capacitor mobile DevOps solution. And currently, I know, I believe that the team is working on deploy support, and that should be available this summer. As a kind of brief note, deploy is one of our really cool feature of ours that lets you ship web asset changes, image changes to your user base, and allows you to kind of do a lot of things with A/B testing, even skipping, because it's going through our deployments. You can make a lot of changes to your code and things and actually skip app store deployments. So the idea there is moving faster. Maybe you have a bug that gets released onto the app store and you want to fix it quickly. So check out AppFlow. We'll drop a link for that, and Ionic Deploy as well. So long story short, Capacitor will be supported in that fairly soon here.
All right, next question. We have built a new app using Ionic 4 and Capacitor. What can you say about the performance of Capacitor animations?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so performance of animations. So I think there's inherent, some slight inherent performance boost by using more of the native modern tooling from iOS and Android specifically. So kind of look out for that over time. Really the best way to get the best performance for your apps, I'd say we'd still recommend pairing Ionic 4, the framework, the web tool UI toolkit, with Capacitor, because because again, Capacitor is focused more on the native side of things and that project management and things like improvements to web views. I'm seeing here questions on that, or animations, really like the UI and UX kind of side of things. Those will still come from Ionic, the framework itself. So again, that's why pairing those two together is the best way to build really amazing apps, I would say.
Okay. Another question is, can you talk about distribution options of apps in an enterprise environment?
Yep. Yep. So really, not a whole lot of, there's really nothing different there with how you do that with Cordova. There's a bunch of the whole deployment process, building an app with Xcode, Android Studio. A lot of that can still be done with the Ionic CLI. And in terms of like more enterprise distribution, take a look at, we have this in our documentation, but the Capacitor doesn't really change any of that. You have the way that those things work are more decided on and distributed by Apple and Google and other providers themselves. So really just take a look at their documentation, but there's not a whole lot of difference with that with Capacitor.
Okay, it looks like we've been getting this question a lot, and I believe you already addressed it, but you might want to again. What is the best way to upgrade from Ionic 3 to Ionic 4?
Oh yeah, sure. So with that one, there is some work involved with that, admittedly, but I think overall it's definitely something to take a look at. Ionic 4 is traditionally those that have Ionic 3 apps, or maybe going back to 1 and 2. That traditionally we've been tied to the Angular framework, right, from Ionic 1 to version 3, and we're still supporting Angular and love Angular. I'm that's honestly my framework or choice these days. But what we've kind of done with Ionic 4 is rewritten it, as we're saying, for the last time. And why that's so powerful is we've now Ionic 4 is built on top of web components, which means we're much closer to browser standards, API standards, things like that, that over the long term will mean that we do not plan to rewrite Ionic and its tooling anymore. And that not only allows us to move faster and release new changes and innovations, but for you, any developers using Ionic can ensure that like the long-term stability of your projects will be a good thing. Specifically about migrating, we do have a migration guide that's in our documentation. We can pull out a link for that and send that out later. But that at a high level, what that looks like is, again, kind of like the Cordova and Capacitor migration process. It's a little bit of like taking a step back, auditing the plugins and the features that you're using, and identifying, really what features do you need, not only just, native plugins, but all types of things like that. And then, typically it depends on how complex your app. Everyone's app is, admittedly, everyone's going to be a little bit different and things like that. But there's a bunch of steps that are involved, but mostly straightforward for the most part. So we'll be sure to. It's a lot to get into on right now, but we'll link to the documentation in a moment. Yeah.
All right. I think we have time for one last question, and this is another question that seems to be coming up a lot. Will Ionic Capacitor work with Ionic AppFlow?
Yes. So going back to kind of the beginning Ionic deploy question, we are actively working on getting out AppFlow support very soon. Look for that this summer. We don't have any firm release dates just yet, but it is being actively worked on, and so keep an eye out for that. Yeah, but I'm looking forward to that support as well, believe me.
All right, looks like that's all the time we have, but before signing off, I wanted to remind everyone that we'll send you a link to today's presentation so that you can view it on demand. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.